You and people like you should never have a place in America." When Marjorie Taylor Greene's voice rang through the studio, Ilhan Omar's calm expression changed. But then the recording she revealed would have the entire country talking. The MSNBC studio lights blazed with an intensity that matched the cultural and political fire about to ignite between two of America's most polarizing congressional figures. It was a tense December evening in 2025, and what was supposed to be a civil discussion about immigration policy was about to become the most explosive revelation about racism in American politics. Ilhan Omar, 42, sat composed in her elegant dark blue hijab and navy blazer, her hands folded calmly on the desk, eyes reflecting the quiet strength that had carried her from a Somali refugee camp to the halls of Congress. Across from her, Marjorie Taylor Greene, 51, adjusted her bright red blazer with the aggressive confidence of someone who had built her entire political brand on controversy. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, expression radiating the combative energy that had made her both beloved and reviled. The moderator, MSNBC's Chris Hayes, had introduced this as a discussion about immigration policy and American values. But everyone in that studio sensed they were about to witness something far more explosive than policy debate. The audience of 180 invited guests represented a cross-section of American political thought: immigration advocates, conservative activists, undecided voters, and political observers who lived for moments when civility broke down and true beliefs emerged. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as the hashtag Ilhan versus MTG began trending before the debate even officially started. What none of them knew was that Ilhan had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not just with policy papers and talking points, but with evidence that would expose the darkest corners of American political racism. Hidden in her phone was a recording so damaging it would force the country to confront the reality of what some of its elected officials really believed about immigrants, Muslims, and anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of American identity. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment when America's immigration divide collided with its deepest racial tensions, live on national television. Marjorie Taylor Greene had spent the weeks leading up to this debate positioning herself as the ultimate defender of real America against what she called the foreign invasion. At 51, the Georgia Congresswoman stood 5 feet 7 inches with the kind of aggressive presence that commanded attention in any room she entered. Her rise from small-town gym owner to one of the most recognizable faces in conservative politics had been meteoric, built on a foundation of conspiracy theories, inflammatory rhetoric, and an apparent willingness to say anything that would generate headlines and outrage. MTG supporters saw her as the only politician brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths about immigration, Islam, and what they viewed as the deliberate transformation of American culture. Her social media presence was a constant stream of provocative statements designed to trigger liberal outrage while energizing her base. She had built her brand on being uncancelable, someone who would never back down from a fight or apologize for speaking her mind. But behind MTG's public persona of fearless truth-telling lay something much darker and more calculated. Her private conversations revealed a level of racial animus and strategic manipulation that went far beyond mere political positioning. She viewed politics not as public service, but as cultural warfare, and she was willing to use any weapon available to win that war. Tonight, those private thoughts will become devastatingly public. Ilhan Omar represented everything MTG's base had been taught to fear and hate. Born in Somalia, she had fled civil war as a child, spending 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp before arriving in America with her family when she was 12 years old. Her journey from refugee to congresswoman embodied the American dream, but for people like MTG, it represented American replacement. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived unimaginable hardship and emerged stronger. Her voice in Congress consistently focused on economic justice, human rights, and the struggles of marginalized communities. Omar's supporters saw her as living proof that America's greatest strength was its ability to welcome people from anywhere in the world who were willing to work hard and contribute to society. Her hijab, her accent, her perspective as both a Muslim and an immigrant brought viewpoints to Congress that had been missing for too long. But her critics viewed her as a symbol of everything they believed was wrong with modern America: foreign, different, threatening to their vision of what the country should be. What made Ilhan particularly effective against opponents like MTG was her combination of personal experience with systematic injustice and her sharp political intelligence. She had faced racism, xenophobia, and religious discrimination her entire life in America, giving her an almost supernatural ability to recognize and counter bigotry in all its forms. Tonight, she would use that ability to devastating effect. The stage was set for more than just a policy debate. This was a collision between two visions of American identity: MTG's narrow, exclusionary nationalism versus Ilhan's inclusive, multicultural democracy. The contrast couldn't have been more stark: the self-appointed defender of real America against someone who had actually lived the immigrant experience that made America great. As the cameras rolled and Chris Hayes welcomed viewers to what he called a crucial conversation about America's immigration future, neither Marjorie Taylor Greene nor Ilhan Omar could have anticipated that this night would become one of the most talked-about moments in the ongoing national conversation about race, religion, and belonging in America. The recording on Ilhan's phone was about to change everything. Chris Hayes opened the discussion with what seemed like a straightforward question about border security, but the tension between the two congresswomen was immediately apparent. Marjorie Taylor Greene, confident in her base's support and her ability to dominate any conversation through sheer aggression, launched into a familiar tirade about illegal immigration and what she called the deliberate destruction of American culture. Her voice carried the kind of barely controlled anger that had become her trademark, discussing immigration as if it were an invasion rather than a humanitarian and economic issue. The reality that people like Ilhan Omar refused to acknowledge. Greene began, her tone already carrying an edge that suggested she was building towards something more personal, is that we have a crisis at our border because Democrats want to replace American citizens with foreign voters who will support their radical agenda. The audience murmured uncomfortably. Even for a political debate, the replacement language was inflammatory, carrying echoes of white supremacist conspiracy theories that had motivated multiple mass shootings. Greene continued, her confidence growing as she sensed she had the audience's attention. When you have people coming to this country who refuse to assimilate, who want to impose their foreign values on our communities, who see America as something to be conquered rather than something to be grateful for, you're not talking about immigration. You're talking about invasion. Her eyes fixed on Ilhan as she delivered what was clearly intended as a personal attack, disguised as policy discussion. And when we elect people to Congress who seem more loyal to their countries of origin than to America, who constantly criticize this country while defending our enemies, we have to ask ourselves whether we're committing national suicide. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. While Greene hadn't mentioned Ilhan by name, everyone understood exactly who she was talking about. The cameras caught Ilhan's expression, calm but alert, like someone who had heard these attacks countless times before and was prepared for what was coming. When Hayes turned to her for a response, Ilhan leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel that those who knew her recognized as dangerous. "Congresswoman Greene, it's interesting that you talk about loyalty and gratitude," she began, her slight accent making her words even more powerful in contrast to Greene's harsh delivery. "Because I think the American people deserve to know what you really think about immigrants, about Muslims, about anyone who doesn't look like you or worship like you." Greene's aggressive smile flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I think exactly what most Americans think, that this country belongs to Americans, not to people who want to fundamentally transform it into something unrecognizable." "Americans like me?" Ilhan's eyebrow raised slightly. "Because I am American, Congresswoman Greene. I took an oath to defend the Constitution, just like you did. I represent American citizens, just like you do. The only difference is that I remember what it was like to not be American, so I don't take this country for granted. You don't take it for granted? Greene's voice rose, and something in her tone suggested she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. You've spent your entire career in Congress criticizing America, undermining our allies, and defending people who want to destroy us. The audience was getting restless now, sensing that this was moving beyond policy disagreement into personal territory. Hayes attempted to restore order, but both women were locked in a confrontation that had been years in the making. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. While Greene hadn't mentioned Ilhan by name, everyone understood exactly who she was talking about. The cameras caught Ilhan's expression, calm but alert, like someone who had heard these attacks countless times before and was prepared for what was coming. When Hayes turned to her for a response, Ilhan leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel that those who knew her recognized as dangerous. Congresswoman Greene, it's interesting that you talk about loyalty and gratitude, she began, her slight accent making her words even more powerful in contrast to Greene's harsh delivery. Because I think the American people deserve to know what you really think about immigrants, about Muslims, about anyone who doesn't look like you or worship like you. Greene's aggressive smile flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. I think exactly what most Americans think, that this country belongs to Americans, not to people who want to fundamentally transform it into something unrecognizable. Americans like me? Ilhan's eyebrow raised slightly. Because I am American, Congresswoman Greene. I took an oath to defend the Constitution, just like you did. I represent American citizens, just like you do. The only difference is that I remember what it was like to not be American, so I don't take this country for granted. You don't take it for granted? Greene's voice rose, and something in her tone suggested she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. You've spent your entire career in Congress criticizing America, undermining our allies, and defending people who want to destroy us. The audience was getting restless now, sensing that this was moving beyond policy disagreement into personal territory. Hayes attempted to restore order, but both women were locked in a confrontation that had been years in the making. The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Greene's earlier aggression had been replaced by something that looked very much like panic. This recording was made during a private fundraising event at Mar-a-Lago. Ilhan continued. You might want to listen carefully, because your own words are about to expose everything you just said as the tip of a much darker iceberg. And then she pressed play. The audio quality was crystal clear, filling the studio with voices that everyone immediately recognized. Marjorie Taylor Greene's distinctive Georgia accent came through the speakers first, but in a context completely different from her public appearances, casual, unguarded, speaking to people she clearly viewed as allies. The thing these people don't understand, Greene's recorded voice said, is that this isn't about legal versus illegal immigration. This is about whether America remains a white Christian nation or becomes some multicultural hellscape. A second voice, unfamiliar to most, but clearly another conservative figure, responded, but we can't say that publicly. The media would destroy us. Greene's laugh was audible and chilling. Of course we can't say it publicly. That's why we use coded language. We talk about values and assimilation and American culture, but everyone knows what we really mean. The studio erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Greene sat frozen in her chair, her face now completely drained of color. The confident political warrior who had entered the debate had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified. But the recording wasn't finished. The truth is, Greene's voice continued through the speakers. People like Ilhan Omar will never be real Americans no matter how long they're here. They're biological enemies. Their DNA, their religion, their entire way of thinking is incompatible with Western civilization. The unknown voice asked, what about the ones who serve in the military, who become doctors and teachers? Doesn't matter, Greene replied, her tone matter of fact. A wolf in sheep's clothing is still a wolf. These people are genetically programmed to destroy our society from within. The fact that some of them are smart enough to be doctors just makes them more dangerous. The recording continued for another devastating minute. with Greene casually discussing her belief that non-white immigration represented an existential threat to white Americans, that Islam was inherently incompatible with democracy, and that politicians like Ilhan Omar were part of a deliberate plan to destroy America from within. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the studio was deafening. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had entered the debate as a confident representative of conservative immigration policy, now sat slumped in her chair, looking like someone whose entire world had just collapsed. Ilhan calmly put her phone back down and looked directly at Greene. "So, Congresswoman Greene, would you like to continue our discussion about who belongs in America?" The audience erupted. Some people were on their feet, shouting in anger. Others sat in stunned silence. Conservative viewers who had come to support Greene looked betrayed and furious. Progressive audience members were cheering, but even they seemed shocked by the completeness of Greene's exposure. Chris Hayes, veteran journalist that he was, struggled to maintain control of the situation. "Congresswoman Greene," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "would you like to respond to what we just heard?" Greene attempted to speak several times, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she managed to stammer, "That recording, it's taken out of context. It doesn't represent—" "Out of context?" Ilhan interrupted, her voice now carrying the full force of years of accumulated anger at exactly this kind of racism. "Congresswoman Greene, we just heard you say that people like me are biological enemies, that we're genetically programmed to destroy America. What context could possibly excuse that?" Greene's media training finally kicked in, and she attempted to go on the offensive. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You ambush people with illegally recorded conversations instead of debating actual policy." "Illegally recorded?" Ilhan pulled out a folder from beside her chair. "Congresswoman Greene, this was recorded at a public fundraising event. You were speaking to donors who paid to hear your real views. There's nothing illegal about recording public statements." She held up several documents. "And I have the guest list right here, along with signed affidavits from 3 people who were present and willing to testify about what you said." Greene's face went from pale to green. Clearly, there was more evidence than just the recording. "You want to talk about policy?" Ilhan continued, standing up now, her presence commanding the entire studio. "Let's talk about the policy of honesty. Let's talk about the policy of representing all your constituents, not just the ones who share your racial and religious background." She turned to face the cameras directly, speaking not just to the studio audience, but to the millions watching at home. "What you just heard is everything that's wrong with American politics. We have elected officials who say one thing in public and believe something completely different in private. We have people in Congress who view millions of American citizens as biological enemies simply because of their race or religion." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Congresswoman Greene just admitted on tape that when she talks about values and assimilation, she's using coded language to hide her belief that non-white Americans can never truly belong in this country. She admitted that she views Islam as inherently incompatible with democracy, despite the fact that I and millions of other Muslim Americans serve this country every day. She turned back to Greene, who was now visibly sweating under the studio lights. "So before you ever again question my loyalty to America, before you ever again suggest that I don't belong here, maybe you should ask yourself whether someone who views millions of American citizens as biological enemies should be representing them in Congress." The studio erupted again, but this time it was sustained applause mixed with angry shouts. The conservative section of the audience looked stunned and betrayed, while others were on their feet cheering. But perhaps most importantly, the undecided voters in the middle looked disgusted, not just with Greene, but with the revelation of how deep racial animus ran in parts of American politics. Greene attempted one final defense. "You don't understand the complexities of immigration and cultural preservation," she said, her voice desperate now. "Sometimes you have to make tough statements to protect." "Protect what?" Ilhan's voice rose with controlled fury. "Protect white supremacy? Protect the idea that only certain Americans are real Americans? Protect your ability to dehumanize people who look like me." She gestured toward the audience. These are the people you were just calling biological enemies. These are the Americans whose loyalty you question every day. These are the citizens you think should never have a place in the country they love and serve. The cameras caught individual faces in the audience. A Muslim veteran who looked betrayed, a Latino small business owner who seemed hurt and angry, an elderly white woman who appeared shocked by what she had heard. These were exactly the Americans that Greene had dismissed so casually on the recording. You want to know the difference between us, Congresswoman Greene? Ilhan continued, her voice now steady and powerful. I came to this country as a refugee, grateful for the opportunity to build a life here. You were born here and have spent your career trying to make other Americans feel unwelcome in their own country. She paused, letting her words sink in. I became a member of Congress to fight for policies that would help all Americans, regardless of their race, religion, or country of origin. You became a member of Congress to wage war on Americans who don't look like you or worship like you. The contrast was stark and devastating. Here was Ilhan, articulating the inclusive vision of American democracy that had drawn immigrants to the country for generations, facing off against Greene, who had just been exposed as viewing that diversity as an existential threat. Chris Hayes attempted to give Greene one final chance to respond. Congresswoman Greene, these are serious allegations about your fundamental views on American citizenship and belonging. How do you respond? Greene's answer was telling in its desperation. This is all political theater, she said, her voice cracking slightly. My record speaks for itself. I've always fought for American citizens. American citizens like me? Ilhan's eyebrow raised dangerously. Because we just heard you say that people like me can never be real Americans, that we're biological enemies, that our very presence in this country represents an existential threat. She held up the documents again. These are my interpretations of your words, Congresswoman Greene. These are your exact words, recorded at an event where you thought you were speaking to allies who shared your views. The final exchange crystallized everything wrong with American political discourse. Here was a member of Congress who had built her career on coded appeals to racial resentment, finally exposed for the explicit white supremacist views that drove her political positions. When confronted with her own words, her only defense was to claim they had been taken out of context or to attack the messenger rather than address the message. As the segment officially ended, Greene gathered her materials quickly, clearly wanting to escape as fast as possible. Gone was the confident culture warrior who had entered the studio, replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken by the exposure of her true beliefs. Ilhan, meanwhile, remained calm and composed, accepting congratulations from audience members who approached her after the cameras stopped rolling. Her performance had been masterful. She had used Greene's own words to expose not just individual racism, but the broader pattern of coded language and dog whistles that dominated conservative immigration discourse. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything MSNBC had ever experienced. Social media exploded with clips of the recording, reaction videos, and analysis of what this meant for American politics. Hashtag #GreenExposed began trending within minutes, followed quickly by hashtag biological enemies and hashtag Ilhan wins. Conservative commentators struggled to defend Greene, with many simply refusing to address the content of the recording. Some attempted to claim it was fake, but the audio experts who analyzed it quickly confirmed its authenticity, and the witnesses who had been present at the fundraising event began speaking publicly about what they had heard. Republican leadership found themselves in an impossible position. Greene's comments went far beyond typical political rhetoric into explicit white supremacist territory. The idea that millions of American citizens were biological enemies because of their race or religion was impossible to defend or explain away. Perhaps most importantly, the exposure sparked a broader conversation about the coded language that had become commonplace in immigration discourse. Greene's admission that terms like values and assimilation were deliberate euphemisms for racial exclusion forced a reckoning with how much of conservative immigration policy was actually driven by racial animus rather than legitimate policy concerns. Within 24 hours, multiple corporations had pulled their support from Greene's campaigns and causes. Her speaking engagements were canceled, Her book deal was terminated, and even some of her most loyal supporters began distancing themselves from her explicitly racist statements. Greene attempted damage control with a carefully crafted statement released through her lawyers. The recording played by Congresswoman Omar was obtained illegally and taken completely out of context. My comments were made in a private setting and do not reflect my public positions or my record of service to all Americans. This attack on my character is exactly the kind of political theater that Americans are tired of. But the damage was done. The recording was too clear, too extensive, and too consistent with Greene's public statements to be dismissed as taken out of context. The witnesses who confirmed its authenticity made claims of illegal recording impossible to sustain. She continued, "The American people deserve representatives whose private convictions match their public statements. They deserve leaders who actually believe that all Americans belong in America, regardless of their race, religion, or country of origin." What we heard on that recording was a confession that Congresswoman Greene views millions of American citizens as enemies simply because of their identity. The broader implications of the confrontation extended far beyond the two participants. The recording had exposed something that civil rights advocates had long suspected but rarely been able to prove, that explicit white supremacist ideology was driving policy positions that were presented as legitimate conservative concerns about immigration and cultural change. It also highlighted the power of authentic voices like Ilhan, who had experienced the discrimination she spoke about rather than simply studying it in policy papers. The contrast between her lived experience as an immigrant and refugee and Greene's theoretical fears about cultural replacement had been stark and powerful. For many Americans, the confrontation served as a wake-up call about the importance of understanding the real motivations behind political rhetoric. Greene's admission that she used coded language to hide her true beliefs raised questions about how many other politicians might be doing the same thing. The debate also demonstrated the ongoing relevance of America's founding ideals in contemporary political discourse. Ilhan's defense of inclusive democracy against Greene's exclusionary nationalism had reminded viewers of the values that were supposed to distinguish American democracy from other political systems. 3 months after the confrontation, Marjorie Taylor Greene had effectively been marginalized within her own party. Republican leadership quietly removed her from her committee assignments, her fundraising dried up, and even conservative media outlets seemed reluctant to book her as a guest. The recording had not just embarrassed her. It had revealed beliefs that were too extreme even for a party that had embraced increasingly radical rhetoric. The civil rights organizations that had been tracking Greene's statements used the recording as evidence in multiple investigations into white supremacist infiltration of American politics. The explicit nature of her comments provided clear documentation of the ideology driving much of the anti-immigration rhetoric that had become mainstream in conservative politics. Ilhan, meanwhile, had used the moment to build an even larger platform for immigration reform and civil rights advocacy. Her calm, prepared response to Greene's attacks had demonstrated the kind of political skill that many observers believe could take her to the highest levels of American politics. But perhaps the most important outcome was the broader conversation the confrontation had sparked about belonging and identity in America. The recording had forced a national discussion about what it really meant to be American, who got to decide who belonged, and whether the country could live up to its founding ideals of equality and inclusion. 6 months later, when political historians looked back at this moment, they would identify it as a turning point, the night when the coded language of modern racism was finally decoded for all to see, and when the difference between authentic American values and nationalist exclusion was made crystal clear. The confrontation between Ilhan Omar and Marjorie Taylor Greene would be remembered not just as a political moment, but as a moral one, a clear example of the ongoing struggle between America's ideals and its prejudices. In exposing Greene's belief that millions of Americans were biological enemies, Ilhan had reminded the country that the fight for an inclusive democracy was far from over. The lesson was simple but profound. In American politics, Authenticity and lived experience would always triumph over performative hatred and manufactured fear. Greene had learned that lesson the hard way, while Ilhan had demonstrated its power in the most public way possible. As the story continued to ripple through American politics, one thing became clear. The age of politicians being able to hide their true beliefs behind coded language was coming to an end. The Greene recording had changed the rules of the game, and authentic leaders like Ilhan were the ones best positioned to succeed under those new rules. This wasn't just the story of a political confrontation. It was a reminder of what American democracy could and should be when it lived up to its highest ideals. It was the night Ilhan's recording exposed the truth about who some people really thought deserved to belong in America, and in doing so, reminded everyone what America was supposed to be.